The night I helped a drunk stranger stand up, I had no idea an entire city was already searching for him. I still remember the smell of fresh rain rising from the concrete outside the office tower as my shift was finally coming to an end. It was almost 1 o'clock in the morning, and every floor of the building had become quiet except for the distant hum of elevators and the soft squeak of my janitor cart rolling across polished marble. Most people never notice someone like me. I emptied trash cans. I mopped hallways. I cleaned fingerprints from glass doors before executives returned the next morning. It was honest work, and after losing both of my parents years earlier, honest work had become my way of surviving. My name is Emma Collins, and at 28 years old, I believed life had already shown me every kind of disappointment it could offer. I was wrong. As I pushed my cart toward the underground parking garage, something caught my attention. A dark luxury sedan sat, with its driver's door still open. The engine had long gone silent, but one headlight continued shining across the empty concrete floor. At first, I assumed someone had forgotten to close the door before leaving. Then I noticed a pair of polished black dress shoes resting motionless beside the vehicle. My heart skipped. I slowly walked closer, gripping the handle of my mop more from instinct than fear. A man wearing an expensive charcoal suit sat on the cold concrete with his back against a support column. His tie had loosened. His jacket rested beside him. One hand covered his eyes as though the parking garage lights were painfully bright. An unopened bottle of water sat only a few feet away, untouched. The sharp smell of whiskey lingered in the air, but there was something strangely composed about him despite the obvious signs of exhaustion. He looked less like someone celebrating and more like someone who had simply run out of strength. "Sir?" I asked gently. He lowered his hand and looked at me. I had never seen eyes like his before. They were clear despite the alcohol, carrying a quiet sadness that seemed far older than the man himself. He gave me a tired smile. "I am making a terrible first impression." His voice was calm, educated, almost apologetic. I could have walked away. Most people probably would have. Instead, I picked up the bottle of water and offered it to him. "Try this first," I said. "Coffee can wait." He accepted it without arguing, studying me as though kindness had become something unfamiliar. After a few slow drinks, he tried to stand but immediately lost his balance. I caught his arm before he could stumble, surprised by how naturally my hands reached for someone I had never met. "Easy," I whispered. "Nobody is judging you." He looked at me for several long seconds before quietly asking, "Do you always help strangers?" I smiled without thinking. "Only the ones who look like they need someone to believe they will be okay tomorrow." A faint laugh escaped him, the first genuine sound I had heard all night. Then, somewhere beyond the garage entrance, bright headlights swept across the walls. One black sport utility vehicle turned into the driveway. Then another. Then another. The engine slowed, their headlights cutting through the silence as though every second suddenly mattered. And for reasons I could not explain, the man beside me quietly closed his eyes before whispering, "They found me." The line of black sport utility vehicles stopped just outside the garage entrance, but nobody stepped out immediately. Their headlights washed over the concrete walls, turning every shadow into something larger than life. I felt the man beside me straighten ever so slightly, as though he had expected this moment all along. He slowly handed the bottle of water back to me. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for treating me like a person before asking who I was." I frowned, confused by the strange choice of words. Does everyone usually ask? He gave a tired smile that never quite reached his eyes. Most people only decide how kind they should be after they know my name. Before I could answer, the first vehicle door opened. Four men wearing tailored dark suits walked into the garage with measured steps. They looked more like professional executives than bodyguards, yet every movement carried remarkable discipline. The oldest among them stopped several feet away. His expression softened the moment he saw the man standing beside me. "Sir," he said respectfully, "we have been looking everywhere." The stranger sighed almost like someone who had hoped for one more hour of peace. "I know." None of the men looked at me with suspicion. Instead, one of them quietly nodded in appreciation after noticing that I was still supporting the stranger's arm. It was such an unexpected gesture that I momentarily forgot to let go. The stranger noticed my embarrassment and gently steadied himself. "I can stand now," he said with a grateful smile. "Thanks to you." I finally stepped back, suddenly aware of how unusual the entire situation had become. The oldest man removed his suit jacket and carefully placed it over the stranger's shoulders without saying another word. It was not fear I saw in their faces. It was loyalty. Genuine, unquestionable loyalty. The stranger glanced toward me once more. "May I ask your name?" "Emma," I answered. "Emma Collins." He repeated it softly, almost as though committing it to memory. "Emma, that is a beautiful name." I laughed awkwardly. "I still do not know yours." For just a second, I thought he might tell me. Instead, he shook his head with quiet regret. "Maybe it is better if you do not." His answer should have made me uncomfortable, but somehow it did not. There was sadness in his voice, not secrecy for the sake of pride. One of the suited men approached with a clean white handkerchief. The stranger accepted it, then looked down at the sleeve of my maintenance uniform where a streak of dust had transferred from helping him stand. Without hesitation, he gently brushed it away. "I am sorry," he said. "You finished your work, and I made more for you." Nobody had apologized to me for creating extra work in a very long time. Before entering the waiting vehicle, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, paused for a moment, then quietly placed something inside the front basket of my janitor cart. He never mentioned it. He simply gave me one last grateful look before disappearing into the back seat. The convoy pulled away as silently as it had arrived, leaving the garage. Strangely empty again. I stood there for several minutes before noticing the object resting beside my cleaning supplies. It was a beautifully crafted silver fountain pen engraved with the initials A.M., and beneath those letters were 4 simple words that somehow stayed with me long after sunrise. Kindness is never forgotten. For the next 7 days, I convinced myself that the strange encounter belonged to another life. My routine returned exactly as it had always been. I clocked in a few minutes before sunset, pushed my janitor cart through quiet hallways, emptied recycling bins, polished glass doors until they reflected the city lights outside, and reminded myself that extraordinary things only happened once. The silver fountain pen never left my locker. Every night before starting work, I opened the small metal door just long enough to make sure it was still there. I never used it. Somehow it felt less like a gift and more like a promise I did not yet understand. Every now and then I found myself wondering whether the mysterious stranger had recovered from whatever burden had driven him into that parking garage. I still did not know his name, but I remembered the sadness behind his smile far more clearly than the expensive suit he had been wearing. It was strange how one brief conversation could stay with someone longer than years of ordinary memories. Late Friday afternoon, the office building became unusually busy. Executives rushed through the lobby carrying folders and talking into their phones. Security officers checked every entrance twice. Fresh flowers suddenly appeared behind the reception desk. Even the building manager asked everyone to make sure every floor looked absolutely perfect before evening. I joked that maybe a movie star was coming. He simply smiled nervously and replied, "Someone even more important." That answer only made me laugh. By 8 o'clock, black luxury vehicles had already begun arriving outside the main entrance. Through the tall glass windows, I watched sharply dressed men and women step onto the sidewalk with quiet confidence. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody hurried. Yet somehow the entire atmosphere changed the moment they arrived. It felt less like guests entering a building and more like the building itself was preparing to welcome them. I was replacing a trash liner near the lobby when several security officers suddenly stood straighter than before. One after another, employees discreetly moved aside, creating a clear path from the entrance across the marble floor. Curious, I glanced toward the revolving doors. The first thing I recognized was not the man. It was the calm way everyone around him reacted. Then I saw the charcoal eyes I could never quite forget. He was no longer wearing a loosened tie or leaning against a concrete pillar. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly. His posture was effortless. His expression was composed, confident, and almost impossible to compare with the exhausted stranger I had helped only a week earlier. Behind him walked a small group of impeccably dressed men, each giving him a respectful amount of space. As he entered the lobby, conversations quietly stopped. Several business executives greeted him first, but before answering any of them, his eyes moved across the room until they found mine. For one suspended moment, the crowded lobby disappeared. A warm smile slowly appeared on his face, exactly like the one I remembered from that rainy night. Then something happened that left the entire room frozen in silence. Ignoring everyone waiting to greet him, he walked directly toward the janitor standing beside a cleaning cart, extended his hand with complete sincerity, and said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Miss Collins, I have been hoping to thank you properly." For a moment, I simply stared at his outstretched hand, convinced I had misunderstood what was happening. Around us, executives in tailored suits exchanged confused glances while the reception staff stood perfectly still behind the marble desk. Nobody expected the most important guest in the building to ignore every senior executive waiting to welcome him just to greet the night janitor. I slowly removed my work glove before shaking his hand. His grip was steady, warm, and exactly as respectful as it had been in the parking garage. "It is good to see you again," I said quietly, suddenly aware that dozens of strangers were watching every word. His smile softened. I was beginning to think I would never have the chance. Before I could respond, the building manager hurried toward us with an expression that mixed nervousness and disbelief. "Mr. Moretti," he said carefully, "the board members are waiting upstairs." The name settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Adrian Moretti. I repeated it silently in my mind, finally matching the initials engraved on the silver fountain pen resting inside my locker. Adrian nodded politely, but made no attempt to leave. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small business card with nothing written on it except his full name and a private phone number. "This belongs to you," he said as he handed it to me. "Not because I expect anything from you, because I owe you my gratitude." I looked at the card before shaking my head. "You already thanked me." His expression became thoughtful. "No, Emma. I thank you for helping me stand. I have not yet thanked you for treating me with dignity when you had absolutely no reason to." His words left me unexpectedly speechless. All I had done was offer a bottle of water and a steady arm. Yet somehow he spoke as though those small gestures had carried extraordinary meaning. One of the older gentlemen standing behind Adrian glanced discreetly at his watch, but Adrian ignored the silent reminder. "May I ask you something?" he said. I nodded. "When you found me that night, why did you stay?" I laughed softly, almost embarrassed by the question, because leaving never crossed my mind. He held my gaze for several quiet seconds before giving the smallest nod, as though my answer had confirmed something important. "I thought you might say that." At last he stepped back, understanding that his meeting could not wait forever. "I would like to buy you dinner one evening," he said. "Not as a favor, not as charity, simply as someone who would enjoy another honest conversation." I hesitated. Expensive invitations had never belonged in my world. I do not think people like us usually have dinner together. Adrian's smile returned, calm and genuine. "Emma, people like us shared bottled water on a concrete floor before either of us knew anything about the other. Dinner should be much easier than that." A faint ripple of quiet laughter passed through several people nearby, breaking the tension that had filled the lobby. As Adrian finally turned toward the elevators, every executive instinctively fell into step behind him. Yet just before the elevator doors closed, he looked back across the lobby one last time and said something that only I could hear. "Thank you for reminding me who I wanted to become before the world told me who I had to be." I carried Adrian's business card in the front pocket of my maintenance uniform for 3 days before I finally decided what to do with it. Every time I reached for my keys or a pair of fresh gloves, my fingers brushed against the thick white card with his name printed in simple black letters. I never called. Part of me believed the invitation had only been a polite gesture made in the moment. The other part wondered what someone like Adrian Moretti could possibly want from another conversation with a night janitor. Life continued as it always had. I cleaned conference rooms after important meetings ended. I wiped coffee stains from polished tables where people discussed deals worth more money than I would earn in several lifetimes. Yet something inside me had changed. I found myself noticing how often successful people hurried past those they depended on without ever making eye contact. Adrian had been the exception. One quiet Tuesday evening, just before my shift began, the receptionist approached me carrying a small cream-colored envelope. "This was left for you," she said with an amused smile. "Personally." Inside was a handwritten note. "Emma, I promised dinner, not because I owe you, but because I enjoyed meeting someone who speaks honestly. Thursday evening at 7, if you are willing. If you are not, I will understand completely. Adrian." There was no expensive restaurant advertisement. No dramatic invitation. Just a place, a time, and his signature. I almost laughed at how strangely normal it felt. On Thursday, after finishing my daytime errands, I stood in front of the tiny closet inside my apartment wondering which dress still fit well enough to wear. I owned exactly two. One was for weddings and funerals. The other was a simple navy blue dress that reached just below my knees. I chose the second one. It felt like myself. When I arrived at the restaurant, I immediately understood why people had stared as I walked through the entrance. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across the dining room. A pianist quietly played familiar jazz standards near the fireplace. I briefly considered turning around before anyone noticed me. Then Adrian stood from a corner table the moment he saw me. He was dressed in another perfectly tailored suit, yet his smile looked exactly the same as it had in the parking garage. Genuine, relaxed, grateful. He pulled out my chair before sitting across from me. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Thank you for inviting me," I replied. A server appeared almost instantly, but before handing me the menu, Adrian spoke first. "Please allow Miss Collins to order whatever she likes. There is no wrong choice tonight." I smiled and looked at him across the candlelit table. "You know," I said softly, "I have the feeling everyone in this restaurant knows exactly who you are." Adrian glanced around the room before looking back at me. "That is true." I tilted my head slightly. "The strange part is that you seem happiest talking to the only person here who did not know your name." He laughed quietly, the sound carrying none of the weight I had heard the night we first met. "Emma," he said, "that is exactly why I invited you." Dinner lasted nearly 3 hours, but it never felt long enough. We talked about ordinary things instead of extraordinary lives. Adrian asked about my childhood in Ohio, about the tiny public library where I used to spend every Saturday afternoon, and about why I had chosen to work nights instead of finding an easier schedule. I told him the truth. Night shifts paid a little more, and every extra dollar helped cover rent and student loans that still followed me years after graduation. He listened without interrupting, never checking his phone, never glancing toward the people who quietly greeted him from across the dining room. When I finally asked about his own life, he smiled in a way that suggested the answer was far more complicated than the question. "Most people think power solves loneliness," he said as he slowly stirred his coffee. "They usually discover the opposite after it is too late." Before I could respond, one of the men I recognized from the parking garage approached our table. He leaned down and quietly spoke a few words that I could not hear. Adrian's expression changed almost instantly. The warmth disappeared from his face, replaced by the calm, unreadable look I had seen in the office lobby. He thanked the man, stood from the table, and looked toward the private hallway leading away from the dining room. "Please excuse me for just a few minutes," he said. "I have to handle something." I nodded, expecting him to return quickly, but nearly 20 minutes passed. The restaurant remained elegant and peaceful, yet I found myself watching the hallway more often than my untouched dessert. When Adrian finally returned, he looked composed again, but something was different. His shoulders seemed heavier. His smile required effort. He apologized for the interruption, even though he owed me no explanation. "Everything all right?" I asked gently. He looked down at the table before answering. "Sometimes the people around me believe every problem must be solved immediately. They forget that not every decision needs to be made in the same hour it appears." There was something deeply human in that sentence. It reminded me of exhausted teachers, overworked nurses, and single parents trying to carry more than anyone should. I reached across the table and slid the basket of warm dinner rolls a little closer to him. "Then maybe tonight is not the night to solve everything," I said. "Maybe tonight is just for finishing dinner while the food is still warm." He stared at me for a moment before quietly laughing, the tension leaving his face as naturally as sunlight breaking through clouds. "Do you realize," he said, "that everyone else spent the last 20 minutes trying to convince me to act immediately?" I shrugged. "Sometimes waiting is also a decision." He leaned back in his chair, thoughtful and unusually quiet. Nobody has said that to me in years. For the rest of the evening, he never returned to the subject. As we walked outside beneath the cool city lights, he looked up at the skyline before turning toward me with a gratitude that felt deeper than anything I had done. "Emma," he said softly, "you may never fully understand this, but tonight you saved me from making a choice I would have regretted for the rest of my life." After that evening, something quietly changed between us. Adrian never tried to impress me with expensive gifts or grand promises. Instead, he invited me into ordinary moments that somehow felt far more valuable. Sometimes we shared coffee before my night shift began. Other times we walked through a small public park just after sunrise when the city was still waking up. During those walks, nobody looked twice at the man beside me. He wore simple jackets instead of tailored suits, and for a little while he seemed to enjoy being invisible. I quickly realized that anonymity was a luxury he almost never experienced. The more time we spent together, the more I understood that Adrian lived inside two completely different worlds. One belonged to polished boardrooms, private meetings, and people who measured every conversation by its outcome. The other appeared only in rare moments, usually when nobody else was watching. That was the Adrian who smiled at children feeding ducks in the park, thanked waiters by name, and stopped to hold doors open for strangers carrying heavy bags. It made me wonder how many people had mistaken his position for his personality. One Saturday afternoon, he invited me to visit a charitable learning center his family quietly supported on the east side of the city. There were no television cameras, no speeches, just volunteers helping children with homework while retired teachers read stories aloud. Adrian spent nearly an hour sitting on the floor helping a young boy finish a model airplane. The child had no idea who he was. To him, Adrian was simply another adult willing to listen. On the drive home, I finally asked the question that had been growing inside me for weeks. Why do you keep this place so private? Adrian kept his eyes on the road before answering. Because kindness changes the person receiving it when nobody is watching. Publicity usually changes the person giving it. I sat quietly, letting those words settle in my heart. They sounded less like a lesson and more like a regret learned through experience. As the weeks passed, I also noticed how exhausted he often became after long meetings. It was never physical exhaustion alone. It was emotional. Every decision seemed to carry the weight of dozens of expectations. Every conversation required caution. Every handshake demanded trust that could never be guaranteed. One evening, after we finished dinner at a quiet neighborhood diner instead of another elegant restaurant, Adrian admitted something he had never told me before. Do you know what surprises me most about being with you? I shook my head. He smiled softly. You never ask me for anything. I laughed. That is because friendship is not supposed to come with invoices. He lowered his eyes for a moment before speaking again. You call this friendship. What else would I call it? He looked at me with the same honesty I had seen the night we met in the parking garage. The best part of every week. His words lingered between us long after the conversation ended, and for the first time since our lives unexpectedly crossed, I began to wonder whether the distance between our two worlds was growing smaller or whether my heart had simply started crossing it without asking my permission. The more our lives became connected, the more I noticed the invisible walls surrounding Adrian. They were not made of steel or stone. They were built from expectations, responsibilities, and people who believed they always knew what was best for him. I first understood that truth one rainy evening when I arrived at the charitable learning center a few minutes early. Adrian was standing near the entrance, speaking quietly with two older men dressed in dark overcoats. Their conversation remained calm, but their expressions grew increasingly serious. When they noticed me approaching, both men immediately fell silent. One of them offered a polite smile that never reached his eyes before walking away with his companion. Adrian waited until they disappeared before forcing a small smile. I am sorry you had to see that. I shrugged gently. It looked important. He nodded. Apparently, my personal life has become important to people who believe they should control it. We spent the afternoon helping children organize donated books, but I could feel the weight he carried in every quiet moment. Later that evening, as we drove back through the city, I finally asked the question neither of us wanted to face. Are they worried about me? Adrian remained silent long enough that I already knew the answer. They think you make me unpredictable, he admitted, because I spend less time chasing power and more time living like an ordinary person. I looked out the passenger window at families walking along the sidewalks, carrying grocery bags and laughing together beneath glowing streetlights. That sounds less like a problem and more like progress. Adrian smiled, but sadness remained behind his eyes. Not everyone measures success the same way. Those words stayed with me for days. I began noticing things I had ignored before. The black vehicles parked farther down my street. The respectful distance people maintained whenever Adrian entered a room. The way complete strangers watched me with quiet curiosity simply because I happened to be standing beside him. None of it frightened me. It simply reminded me that his world would never truly become mine. One evening, after finishing my shift, I unlocked the door to my apartment and found the silver fountain pen resting exactly where I had placed it weeks earlier. I picked it up and turned it slowly between my fingers, remembering the 4 words engraved beneath his initials. Kindness is never forgotten. Suddenly I realized something painful. Adrian had spent weeks learning how to find peace, and somehow I had become part of that peace. But peace was also becoming the very thing others believed he could not afford. I barely slept that night. By morning, my decision had quietly settled inside my heart. I wrote him a short handwritten letter thanking him for every conversation, every sunrise walk, and every reminder that goodness could still exist inside complicated lives. I explained that sometimes caring for someone meant stepping back before the weight of your presence became another burden they had to carry. I left the letter inside the pages of the novel he had once told me was his favorite, then placed it in the care of the receptionist at his office building. As I walked away beneath the bright morning sky, my heart felt impossibly heavy, yet one thought gave me the strength to keep moving. If I truly wanted Adrian to become the man he believed he could be, I could not become the reason he had to choose between happiness and responsibility. 3 months passed before I saw Adrian again. By then I had left the downtown office tower and accepted a full-time position at the charitable learning center where we had once volunteered together. The pay was smaller, but every morning I arrived knowing that my work would help children discover books instead of polishing conference tables after people forgot they had used them. Life became quieter, simpler. I still kept the silver fountain pen inside my desk drawer, and every now and then I wondered whether Adrian had understood why I walked away or whether he believed I had simply disappeared without looking back. Then, on a bright Saturday afternoon, while helping a little girl choose her first chapter book, I noticed a familiar voice thanking someone near the entrance. I looked up, and there he was. Adrian stood alone, wearing blue jeans, a light gray sweater, and the same calm smile that had first greeted me across a cold parking garage floor. There were no black sport utility vehicles waiting outside, no line of executives, no carefully measured distance between him and everyone else. He looked lighter somehow, as though months of carrying invisible weight had finally begun to fade. Our eyes met, and neither of us spoke for several long seconds. The little girl beside me smiled and ran toward the reading corner with her new book, leaving us standing only a few feet apart. "You found me," I whispered. Adrian nodded gently. "You always said that kindness deserved patience." I decided to practice both. I laughed softly, feeling tears gather before I even realized they were there. "I thought leaving was the best thing for you." He stepped closer, but still left enough space to make sure I felt comfortable. "I know. Your letter made that very clear." He smiled with quiet gratitude instead of sadness. It also forced me to ask myself a difficult question. Was I building a life that protected my responsibilities, or was I protecting my responsibilities so carefully that I forgot how to live? I did not know how to answer. Fortunately, he already had one. "I made changes," he continued. "I delegated more. I trusted people instead of trying to carry everything alone. I began spending my time where it actually mattered." He looked around the learning center as children laughed over puzzles and stacks of colorful books. Places like this. I felt the distance that had once separated our worlds quietly disappear without either of us trying to erase it. It was never money that had stood between us. It had been fear. Fear that one person would have to become someone else to deserve the other. Adrian reached into his pocket and placed the silver fountain pen in my hand. I looked at him, confused. "You left this behind in your letter," he said with a smile. "I think it always belonged with the person who taught me what those words truly meant." I turned the pen over and traced the familiar engraving with my thumb. Kindness is never forgotten. This time, those words no longer felt like a promise waiting for tomorrow. They felt like the story of everything we had become. Looking back now, I still believe I only helped a tired stranger stand on a rainy night. I never expected that the greatest life I would ever help rebuild would be my own.